The morning sun painted the Arizona desert in shades of gold and orange when 15-year-old Ayanna first heard the distant sound of horses. He was collecting water from the hidden spring his father had shown him just weeks before, carefully filling the leather pouches that would sustain their small family through another day in their mountain hideout. The sound made his blood run cold because horses meant soldiers, and soldiers meant trouble for any Apache still living free in these lands. Ayanna's father, Nalnish, was one of the last great war chiefs of their people. While other Apache leaders had been forced onto reservations or killed in battle, Nalnish had managed to keep his small band of 23 warriors and their families hidden in the remote canyons of the Dragoon Mountains. For 3 years they had lived like shadows, moving from cave to cave, surviving on what the harsh desert provided and what they could take in quick raids on isolated settlements. The boy dropped his water pouches and crept toward the sound, moving as silently as his father had taught him. Through the sparse vegetation, he could see a line of blue-uniformed cavalry soldiers winding their way up the narrow trail that led to their camp. There were at least 40 of them, far too many for his father's small band to fight successfully. Ayanna's heart pounded as he counted the rifles and realized that someone had betrayed their location to the army. Racing back through the familiar rocks and hidden paths, Ayanna burst into their camp to find chaos already beginning. His father was shouting orders to the other warriors, telling them to gather their families and escape through the back canyon, while he and a few volunteers stayed behind to delay the soldiers. The women were quickly packing only the most essential belongings, and children were crying as they sensed the fear in their parents' voices. Nalnish grabbed his son by the shoulders, his weathered face serious but calm. The war chief had lived through many battles and narrow escapes, but this time felt different. The soldiers had come too close to their secret refuge, and they had too many men and too much determination. He pressed his sacred medicine bag into Ayanna's hands and spoke words that would haunt the boy forever. The older Apache warrior looked directly into his son's eyes and spoke in their native tongue, his voice steady despite the approaching danger. He told Ayanna that if anything happened to him, the boy must survive and find a way to carry on their people's fight for freedom. The medicine bag contained powerful objects that had been passed down through their family for generations, and it would give Ayanna strength when he needed it most. As the sound of horses grew closer, Nalnish kissed his son's forehead and pushed him toward the escape route, where the other families were already disappearing into the maze of canyons. Ayanna wanted to stay and fight beside his father, but he knew that disobeying would only make things worse. With tears in his eyes, he joined the fleeing group and looked back one last time to see his father and 5 other warriors taking positions behind the rocks, their rifles ready to make their final stand. The last thing Ayanna saw before the canyon wall blocked his view was his father's proud figure silhouetted against the morning sky, standing tall and fearless as the sound of approaching soldiers echoed off the stone walls around him. That image would burn itself into the boy's memory and fuel everything that happened in the days to come. The sound of gunfire echoed through the canyons for what seemed like hours, but Ayanna knew it had probably lasted only minutes. As the surviving members of their band huddled in a hidden cave miles from their former camp, the terrible silence that followed the shooting told them everything they needed to know. The women wept quietly, and the remaining warriors sat in stunned silence trying to process the loss of their leader and friends. Ayanna could not stay still while his father's fate remained unknown. Despite the protests of the other survivors, he slipped away from the group as darkness fell and made his way back toward their old camp. Moving like a ghost through the familiar terrain, he used every skill his father had taught him about stealth and concealment. The desert night was cold, but anger and determination kept him warm as he crept closer to where the battle had taken place. What he found when he reached the camp filled him with both relief and rage. The soldiers had clearly won the fight, but there were no Apache bodies among the scattered belongings and destroyed shelters. This meant that his father and the other warriors had either escaped or been taken prisoner. Ayanna's heart leaped with hope until he found drops of blood on the rocks and pieces of torn Apache clothing, evidence that the fight had been fierce and that some of his people had been wounded. Following the trail left by the soldiers was not difficult for someone with Ayanna's tracking skills. The cavalry horses left deep prints in the sandy ground, and the soldiers had made no effort to hide their path as they headed back toward the nearest military outpost at Fort Bowie. Ayanna shadowed them through the night, staying far enough behind to avoid detection, but close enough to see that they had indeed taken prisoners. as dawn broke over the desert. Ayana finally got a clear view of the cavalry column from his hiding place behind a large boulder. His heart nearly stopped when he saw his father among the prisoners, his hands bound behind his back and tied to a horse. Nalnish looked wounded but alive, blood staining his shirt and his proud head held high despite his capture. The sight of his father as a prisoner filled Ayana with a mixture of joy that he lived and fury at his treatment. The boy counted the soldiers again and realized that rescuing his father would be almost impossible. There were still more than 30 cavalry troopers, and they were well armed and alert for any sign of pursuit. But as Ayana watched his father being led away like a criminal, he remembered the words the war chief had spoken to him before the battle. His father had told him to survive and continue their fight, but Ayana knew he could not do either while Nalnish remained a prisoner. Making a decision that would change his life forever, Ayana began to follow the column toward Fort Bowie. He had no plan yet, no weapons except his knife and his father's old bow, and no allies to help him, but he had something more powerful than any of those things: the absolute determination of a son who would not abandon his father to the enemy, no matter what the cost. As the sun climbed higher and the heat of the desert began to shimmer off the rocks around him, Ayana settled into the rhythm of pursuit that would consume the next several days of his life. He would follow these soldiers wherever they went, learn their habits and weaknesses, and find a way to free his father or die trying. The boy had become a hunter, and his prey was an entire troop of United States cavalry. For 3 days, Ayana followed the cavalry column across the brutal Arizona landscape, staying hidden among the rocks and sparse vegetation while learning everything he could about his enemies. The soldiers traveled in a predictable pattern, making camp each evening near water sources and posting guards in a routine that never changed. Their confidence in their superior numbers had made them careless, and Ayana began to see opportunities in their mistakes. The young Apache survived on cactus fruit and the small amount of dried meat he had managed to grab during their escape from the mountain camp. Water was more difficult to find, but his father had taught him to read the desert signs that led to hidden springs and seeps that the soldiers would never notice. Each night, as the cavalry slept, Ayana crept closer to their camp to check on his father's condition and to gather intelligence about their destination and plans. What he learned during these dangerous scouting missions filled him with growing urgency. The soldiers talked openly around their campfires about delivering their Apache prisoners to Fort Bowie, where they would be loaded onto a train and sent to a reservation in Florida. Ayana knew that once his father disappeared into that distant prison, he would never see him again. The boy also discovered that Nalnish had been wounded more seriously than he had first appeared, and the rough treatment during the forced march was making his condition worse. On the 4th day of pursuit, Ayana's opportunity finally came. The cavalry column had stopped earlier than usual beside a small creek to rest their horses and refill their water barrels. The desert heat was becoming unbearable even for experienced soldiers, and their discipline was beginning to suffer as exhaustion set in. Several troopers had removed their heavy uniforms and were cooling themselves in the shallow water, while others dozed in whatever shade they could find. The young Apache warrior observed that the guards watching the prisoners were also affected by the heat and the monotony of their duty. They sat in the meager shade of a dead tree, their rifles propped against their knees, occasionally glancing toward the 3 bound Apache captives, but mostly just trying to stay cool. Ayana's father and the 2 other prisoners were tied to stakes driven into the ground about 50 yards from the main camp, positioned where they could be easily watched but far enough away to prevent them from hearing military conversations. As the afternoon wore on and the heat became even more oppressive, Ayana noticed that the guards began to take turns leaving their posts to get drinks of water or to cool their feet in the creek. During one of these brief absences, only a single soldier remained watching the prisoners, and he appeared to be half asleep in the shade. The moment had come for Ayana to make his move, even though he knew the chances of success were small and the consequences of failure would be terrible. Checking his weapons one last time, Ayana began to work his way through the rocks and bushes toward the place where his father was held. His heart pounded so loudly that he was sure the sleeping soldier would hear it, but his father's training in stealth served him well as he moved from cover to cover without making a sound. The medicine bag his father had given him seemed to grow warm against his chest, as if the spirits of his ancestors were lending him strength for what he was about to attempt. When Ayana was within 20 feet of the prisoners, his father somehow sensed his presence and looked directly at him. Nalnish's eyes widened in shock and fear, not for himself, but for his son. The war chief began to shake his head slightly, trying to warn Ayana away from what could only be a suicide mission. But the boy had already committed himself to the rescue attempt, and there would be no turning back now. Ayana waited until the dozing guard's head drooped forward in sleep before making his final approach. Moving with the silence of a hunting cat, he covered the last few yards to where his father was tied and began cutting through the rawhide bonds with his sharp knife. Nalnish whispered urgently for his son to escape while he still could, but Ayana ignored these pleas and worked frantically to free not just his father but the other two Apache prisoners as well. The first sign of trouble came when one of the guards returned early from his trip to the creek and immediately noticed that something was wrong. The soldier shouted an alarm that shattered the peaceful afternoon silence and brought the entire camp to instant alertness. Within seconds, dozens of cavalry troopers were grabbing their weapons and running toward the prisoner area, while Ayana had only managed to completely free one of the captives. Rather than abandon his mission, the young Apache warrior made a decision that shocked even his father. Drawing his bow with lightning speed, Ayana sent an arrow into the shoulder of the closest soldier, then leaped to his feet and began running directly toward the main body of troops, while screaming a traditional Apache war cry. His desperate plan was to draw all the soldiers' attention to himself, giving his father and the other prisoners a chance to escape in the confusion. The bold strategy worked better than Ayana had dared to hope. The surprised cavalry soldiers all turned their attention and their weapons toward the lone Apache boy, charging at them across the open ground. In their excitement and confusion, none of them thought to secure the prisoners who were now only partially tied. Nalnish and his two companions managed to break free from their remaining bonds and began running toward the rocky hills where they would have a chance to hide. Ayana's wild charge carried him through the first line of soldiers before they could react effectively to his unexpected attack. Using his knife and his father's tomahawk, he fought with the fury of a cornered mountain lion, wounding several troopers before a rifle butt struck him in the head and sent him crashing to the ground. As darkness closed in around him, the last thing he saw was his father and the other Apache prisoners disappearing into the maze of boulders and canyons that would hide them from pursuit. When Ayana regained consciousness several hours later, he found himself tied hand and foot in the back of a military wagon. His head throbbed with pain and dried blood covered half his face, but he was alive. The cavalry column was moving again, and from the angry voices of the soldiers around him, he could tell that his father's escape had been successful. The troopers were furious about losing their most important prisoner, and were taking their frustration out on their remaining captive. The officer in charge of the patrol, a hard-faced captain named Morrison, rode up beside the wagon and looked down at Ayana with a mixture of respect and anger. Morrison had fought Apache warriors for most of his military career, and he had never seen anything quite like the desperate courage the boy had shown in rescuing his father. But the captain was also frustrated by the escape of such a notorious war chief, and he made it clear that Ayana would pay the price for his father's freedom. As the wagon bounced and jolted across the desert toward Fort Bowie, Ayana tried to ignore his pain and think about what would happen next. He had succeeded in freeing his father, but now he was alone and facing an uncertain fate as a prisoner of the army. The young Apache warrior had no way of knowing that his act of courage had been observed by someone who would soon change his life in ways he could never have imagined. Fort Bowie was a collection of adobe buildings and wooden structures surrounded by a high wall, sitting like a scar on the desert landscape where once only Apache had traveled freely. As the cavalry patrol approached the fort's gates, Ayana could see curious soldiers and civilians gathering to get a look at the young Apache prisoner, who had single-handedly freed his father from an entire troop of cavalry. Word of his desperate rescue attempt had somehow preceded their arrival, and the boy found himself the center of unwanted attention. Among the crowd watching from the fort's main building was a tall, bearded man in civilian clothes who studied Ayana with intense interest. This was James McKenna, a government Indian agent who had spent years trying to negotiate peaceful surrenders with various Apache bands. McKenna had heard Captain Morrison's report about the boy's incredible courage and tactical intelligence, and something about the young warrior's story had captured his imagination. Ayanna was placed in a stone cell that had been built specifically to hold Apache prisoners awaiting transportation to distant reservations. The cell was small, hot, and designed more to break a prisoner's spirit than to simply confine him. But the young Apache had been raised in the harsh desert environment, and physical discomfort was something he had learned to endure from childhood. What troubled him more than the heat and cramped quarters was not knowing what had happened to his father after the escape. For 3 days, Ayanna sat in his cell and refused to speak to anyone who tried to question him. Army officers came and went, demanding information about other Apache hiding places and the location of his father's new camp. Some tried to intimidate him with threats, while others offered food and better treatment in exchange for cooperation. The boy simply stared at them with the same defiant expression his father had worn during his own captivity, saying nothing and revealing nothing. On the 4th day, James McKenna finally came to visit the young prisoner. Unlike the military men who had questioned Ayanna, McKenna sat down on the floor of the cell and began speaking to the boy in Apache, demonstrating a respect for the culture that surprised and impressed his captive. The Indian agent had learned the language during his years of working with various Apache groups, and he understood something about their values and traditions. McKenna told Ayanna that he had been present when Captain Morrison described the rescue attempt and that the boy's courage had impressed even his enemies. The agent explained that normally a young Apache prisoner would be sent to a reservation school, where he would be forced to abandon his culture and become like a white man. But McKenna had a different proposal, one that might allow Ayanna to help his people while avoiding the fate that had befallen so many other Apache children. The government agent revealed that he had been authorized to recruit a small number of Apache scouts to help the army track down the remaining hostile bands. These scouts would be well paid, well treated, and allowed to maintain many of their traditional customs in exchange for using their skills to help end the Apache wars peacefully. McKenna believed that someone with Ayanna's intelligence and courage could be valuable in this role, and might even be able to help arrange safe surrenders for Apache groups that were tired of constant running and fighting. Ayanna listened to this proposal with growing interest but also with deep suspicion. The idea of working with the army that had captured his father seemed like a betrayal of everything he had been taught. But as McKenna continued to explain the program, the boy began to see possibilities that the agent himself might not have considered. If he could gain the trust of the soldiers and learn their methods, he might be able to find ways to help his people that would be impossible from inside a reservation school or prison cell. After 2 more days of careful consideration, Ayanna finally agreed to McKenna's proposal, but with conditions that surprised the government agent. The young Apache insisted that he be allowed to contact his father through traditional Apache communication methods to explain his decision and seek approval. He also demanded that any Apache groups he helped to locate be treated with respect and given fair terms for surrender, rather than being forced into harsh conditions that had driven so many bands back to the warpath. McKenna agreed to these conditions, recognizing that Ayanna's terms showed both wisdom beyond his years and a deep loyalty to his people that could be channeled in positive directions. The agent also understood that having the approval of a respected war chief like Nalnish would give Ayanna credibility with other Apache groups that might otherwise view him as a traitor for working with the army. The process of contacting Nalnish took several weeks and required all of Ayanna's knowledge of traditional Apache signaling methods, using smoke signals, rock cairns, and messages left in sacred locations. The boy was able to establish communication with his father's hidden band. When Nalnish finally understood his son's plan, the war chief's response showed the strategic thinking that had kept him free for so many years. Nalnish gave his approval for Ayanna's work as a scout, but also provided his son with secret instructions that would guide his actions. The old war chief understood that the Apache wars were coming to an end, and that continuing to fight would only result in more death and suffering for their people. If his son could help arrange honorable surrenders for Apache bands that were ready to give up the fight, it would be a way of serving their people even while working with their former enemies. Ayanna's first assignment as an Apache scout came just 2 weeks after his agreement with McKenna. A small band of Apache raiders had been attacking supply wagons near the Mexican border, and the army needed someone who could track them through the mountainous terrain where they were hiding. The young scout's knowledge of Apache tactics and his ability to think like a warrior, rather than a soldier, proved invaluable in locating the raiders' camp. But when the time came for the army to attack the camp, Ayana managed to arrange a meeting with the Apache leader first. Using his father's name and reputation, he convinced the raiders that they were facing impossible odds and that surrender would be better than certain death in a hopeless battle. The Apache band agreed to give up their weapons in exchange for fair treatment and the promise that their families would be protected. This peaceful resolution of what could have been a bloody battle earned Ayana respect from both the army officers and the Apache scouts who worked with him. Word of his success began to spread among the scattered Apache bands, and soon other groups were seeking him out as an intermediary who could be trusted to arrange fair terms with the government. McKenna was amazed by the young scout's ability to end conflicts without violence, something that experienced military officers had rarely been able to accomplish. Over the following months, Ayana helped arrange the peaceful surrender of more than a dozen small Apache bands, saving countless lives on both sides while earning a reputation as a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for decades. But his greatest challenge was yet to come. When word reached him that his father's band was finally ready to consider surrender, and that Nalnish wanted his son to arrange the terms that would end his long fight for Apache freedom.